Howard, thank you for coming onto the show.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be here. Thanks, Andy.
So, Howard, your situation is a little bit unique, and I've been really keen to get somebody like you onto the show for a while. We've got a massive community, we've got lots of investors overseas, and you are one of them. And today, what I'd love to do is talk to you a little bit about what that experience has been like for you, the challenges, the pros and cons. And I know that you've got, just from our brief conversation before we kicked off, quite a lot to share. So, for those of our listeners who perhaps don't know you that well, Howard, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're currently doing in the property space?
I grew up in Bristol in the UK. I stayed there for a little bit after studies. I worked there for a bit, and then I was lucky enough to be able to combine my interest in travel, and ended up moving overseas with my day job. So I've been an expat now for approaching 10 years. I'm not sure where that time went, but yeah, and currently living in Amsterdam at the moment. Um, I still work full time. Spent the last 15 years working in kind of engineering and construction project management. I'm currently working as a associate director in a kind of a large main contractor. You know, do enjoy the day job, but ultimately the property is about giving me more choice in the future. And those in terms of kind of the property side and the businesses, it's been split really in two. Started off initially kind of educating myself around property probably around 2015. It started then with a refurbishment of my kind of residential home at the time. And then I followed this expat playbook really of going through properties which were low maintenance, single lets, and ready to move in. It's felt safer, easier to manage, but reached a bit of a tipping point in 2020 when I actually realised it wasn't really aligned with my goals. It wasn't getting the cash flow that I wanted in the speed that I wanted. And then I went back to the beginning, really. And there's quite a big journey in that bit in itself, but I ended up landing on student HMOs. So we're invested now in serving the University of Gloucestershire, looking at kind of high quality HMOs around 15-minute walk from the campus, and looking to kind of offer value for money, I suppose.
That sounds really interesting, Howard. So, and actually, just to give a bit of context to this, your job, the firm that you work for, you are responsible for doing some really huge projects. I think, did you say 50 billion to me before?
50 million euros.
50 million euros.
That's
Okay.
the largest project I've been personally responsible for leading. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So not 50 billion, but still a huge sum of money. So actually, HMOs for you, Howard, should you would think be a piece of cake, certainly managing the refurbs and things. But I'm sure when we get on to doing that from quite a distance, maybe there are some very different challenges. But it sounds like you picked up this playbook, and actually, while you were able to do it and deliver on it, the results weren't actually what you and I guess you as a family needed. And so you sort of you chucked it away, and actually you kind of rewrote your own playbook, did you?
Pretty much. I mean, it works. It works for many people. It wasn't really working for me. And it's, a lot of the choice that I wanted. You need some cash flow to replace salary if that's what the intention is, to either drop down or replace the job altogether. But the buying properties where you cannot add value um, actually makes it hard to grow quickly because it's not really an investable model. You can't really get private finance for that unless they're willing to sit around and wait for the market to move as well. So I had to go back to the beginning, and as you touched on, obviously my background in construction project management certainly helps, and I thought I need to, one, I enjoy it, and two, actually I should be utilizing that skill set.
I think it's very true, isn't it? Trying to recycle large amounts of capital and at the same time create a good rent roll. That's a bit of a challenge anyway. I think particularly in the single let space, that's incredibly difficult, and you've really got to be quite creative and very good at finding opportunities to be able to force enough value out to actually get a lot of traction and momentum in the single let market. It's just very difficult to pull enough funds out to maybe pay an investor back and also move on to the next one. So I completely understand that. And I guess that led you then to HMOs. But obviously, the student model is just one of a few models, and one of a few models that I regularly talk about on the show. Now, as all of our listeners will know, I've got a real soft spot for student property, and I'm really keen to find out why you went down that route. But before we get onto that, Howard, can you talk to us a little bit about what the reality of investing overseas and into UK property is actually like? What are the considerations that you have to make? What are the challenges? What makes it difficult? And I suppose why are there so few people who are able or seemingly able to do it successfully?
Um, there definitely are challenges, of course. I think a lot of it is around obviously being not being there. You're reliant so much on what other people can do, and no managing. You can use professionals, managing agents and things like that, but they're not necessarily all equal. And I think as you start kind of setting up, especially if you don't know the area at all, you have to start from the beginning, and you have to do everything completely remotely, from identifying the kind of areas to actually building up a bit of a profile of what that kind of location looks like, what profitability it is to operate in that kind of space, and what people actually want. And I think it definitely gets easier the longer you go on. But the key challenge really is around needing other people as much, and trying to de-risk that, probably by doing as much due diligence as you can yourself.
So when you first started, how long have you been investing in single lets from overseas for?
So first single let was 2017.
Okay. And you built up a small portfolio, or was it a large portfolio of single lets,
No,
Howard?
modest portfolio of single lets,
Modest
yeah.
portfolio. And were there challenges with that? Did a number of those challenges still exist? Because I'm trying to understand how challenging it was, because obviously there was this compromise you were making, this sacrifice, maybe not creating enough cash flow or not generating enough equity to actually build the portfolio that you really wanted, but at the same time still struggling and grappling with these challenges of actually over investing overseas. And I imagine that thinking about investing in HMOs perhaps just put the spotlight on those challenges, and really kind of made you even more conscious of how tough that could be. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. I think having now seen both sides of it, from the single lets and the HMOs, like a lot of the initial finance, or kind of challenges around finance, are similar-ish, albeit as soon as you start going into the realms of HMO mortgage products, for an expat, you start limiting the amount of products that are actually available, and meeting that criteria. So but once you've selected a product, it isn't wildly different. I have now started, and some of the initial ones were in a personal name. Some of them are now or started in a limited company. So, and there's actually differences in costs, what the kind of percentage rates for those mortgage products are as well. But I think having now, once you've kind of obtained the property, you bought it, once you've actually started managing it, I haven't felt a huge difference between single let and HMO, as daunting as it might seem. And I I kind of start to reflect on it a little bit more in terms of cash flow. So if if you have a single let property, or you take the same property, and that one will either generate X for a single let and Y for a HMO. So if you take that, look at it, it's just one single property. It is going to be more effort to manage that HMO than it is a single let. Like, no matter what people say, there's more stuff that's going to be going on.
Absolutely.
But if you start thinking of it as cash flow, so if you take an example of 5 HMOs, and they're generating maybe 1,000 plus per property, to then have that in a comparable of a single let, you might need 15 single lets to achieve the same cash flow as the HMOs. And I don't think people really talk about this enough, in that kind of difference. And I'm not particularly convinced that managing 15 single lets is any easier than 5 HMOs, because you've got 10 extra boilers, 10 extra
Yeah.
sets of people, and personalities, and ASTs, and maintenance. And if you start if you have a really nice, strong, solid HMO portfolio of high quality and you do it right at the refurb, I'm not convinced it's any more management, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I guess you get so much more bang for your buck with the HMOs. So I guess then you're not comparing apples to apples, but actually, when you bunch them all together and you look at what you would need to create the same amount of income, actually all of a sudden single lets and what the volume that you'd need could look substantially more difficult to manage than that small number of HMOs, like you said. 10 extra boilers, 10 extra roofs that could all leak, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Howard, actually. I've never thought about it like that. So I guess then, when you started to look at HMOs, you were really conscious in thinking about exactly what type of HMOs, maybe even the size of the HMOs, and of course, exactly where those HMOs were going to be. Whenever I'm sitting with any of my mentees and we do our first sort of strategy session, a big part of it is always, first of all, establishing what the broad strategy is and whether actually investing in HMOs is right, looking at how to utilise the finance and resources that people have or don't have. But the next big thing is always drilling down into where. And the model can work pretty much anywhere. I mean, there aren't that many places where it doesn't work. Of course, student stuff needs to be close to the universities, but generally speaking, I think that the HMO model works everywhere. But I've found that a lot of people really struggle to determine where they should invest. How did you decide to invest where you've ultimately done it? How did you decide to build that portfolio there?
So I suppose as an expat, depending on if or how often you're planning on coming back, like you pretty much got the whole of the UK to play with, because if you're arriving on a plane, actually the journey time is pretty similar. So I actually I did, location was actually a big thing for me, because whilst I'm overseas at the moment, the plan is to be back home probably in the next couple of years. And part of the wanting control over my life is actually, I've spent a lot of time at airports and planes and traveling to places, and I didn't really see the value in when I get back to the UK. I didn't really want to replace those journey times with a car journey to somewhere remote. So
Yeah.
I was quite deliberate in my location. I knew if I come back to the UK, it's going to be to the southwest. So I literally put a radius around it on journey times, and I started breaking down what areas are there. What, like you said, obviously universities, also large employers. I wasn't at the time. I wasn't necessarily committed on students. Um, and then start to build up that profile and the demographic and get a feel for actually what are in those locations, and then start to break down, understand the profile of what's it cost to buy a standard 3-bed house, 4-bed house in average condition or poor condition. Start to build up a comparable. You start seeing which areas, and it doesn't take long before you start narrowing that down and you start to get a bit of a gut feel of what might work for you.
It's very interesting. So you actually reverse engineered your plan. You said, this is what I kind of want to build on a very personal level in terms of my commitment to travel and time and things like that. And you drew a radius that would allow you to kind of build that. And I think that I see this a lot. A lot of people actually are driven by yield and numbers and the economics. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think at the same time, anybody who does make a decision based on that really does have to also understand that the logistics and the practical challenges of managing a portfolio that's further away, the further away it is, the more difficult that it becomes.
Yeah.
We can all outsource management, we know that, but you can't outsource being a landlord, can you? There's still things that you have to do and decisions that you have to make as a landlord. And of course, if you're building a portfolio, you still need to have a certain degree of presence to actually allow you to do that. Meet contractors, review things, understand what's actually happening on the ground level. So it's really fascinating to understand and to hear how you've made this very, very conscious decision. And actually, you're thinking several years ahead. You're not actually just buying for cash flow today. You're actually buying for cash flow and an investment value for the future, which, again, when it comes to HMOs, I think the short-term benefits really pale in significance compared to the long-term benefits that you can build if you build the right portfolio.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to actually come to that conclusion then, Hal? From maybe kind of thinking, you know what, maybe it's time to move on from single lets to actually kind of deciding this is where I'm going to buy the first property. How long did that process take you?
I think it's probably the best part of 5 months, which probably sounds crazy, but I basically um, went through a breakdown, trying to work out exactly, what profile of investment for a while, and that probably took the best part of a couple of months. By that point, I had a good feel that it was going to be HMOs. I then actually went on a strategy day with someone that had been there before me and had that kind of experience. And then this took my analysis to the next level of detail, to be honest. And I've spent then probably another 3 months then of nailing down exactly what it was, not just the location. I was then starting to zero down on, where I was actually wanting to look for properties and get into real kind of detail, from looking at census information to looking at crime statistics to all sorts of stuff, to build out my own personal maps of bus routes, and really geeked out of the detail, if I'm honest. But it gave me the confidence, and ultimately, this was during the pandemic. I was overseas. The world was pretty much in lockdown. I had no choice, so I did everything remotely. And I hadn't seen the area. I hadn't seen the house I bought until I literally got the keys. So I needed that level of detail and due diligence to feel confident that it was going to work, because, like you say, this is not. I want long-term assets. This is not for quick cash flow. This is something I'd like. No intention of selling it. This is a nice solid portfolio for good, kind of thing.
So 5 months it took you to really figure out and say, this is it, this is where I'm. Interestingly, you said that sounds mad, but to me, actually, that doesn't sound mad at all. There is so much to consider. And actually, that radius that you've drawn, that initial radius, would have still been quite a large area. A lot of places to consider. Obviously, you narrowed that down to students, and that will have been part determined by where the universities were. But that radius still would have been a huge area with a lot of places that you could consider in that. And it sounds like you looked from a bird's eye view, and then you just sort of narrowed your focus further and further and further and further until you were happy that there was one location that had all, or at least more than any other area in terms of what it had to offer for you. Is that pretty much how you did it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll start to, it didn't take too long to whittle it down to a few locations, but and then you start to get a gut feel. Things start to make sense, and it wasn't just about buying a property. I had considerations of, I wanted to make it repeatable, investable model. There's no benefit in doing it once. I wanted that position where I could repeat it as quickly as I could, kind of thing. And it felt counterintuitive initially, because I stopped investing effectively for a bit, and it felt wrong. But the speed and the trajectory now from having done that is completely different. I'm glad I did it ultimately.
Yeah, I suppose taking a step back so that you could take several steps forwards.
Yeah.
So what data were you actually looking at then? What data were you trying to find to support this thesis of I should invest in this location? What sort of stuff was it that you discovered and found that said, you know what, that's good, that's another tick in the box?
So I suppose once I'd reached the student HMO phase, there's all sorts of data that you can, like the university campus themselves will do estate management plans. They'll tell you where they've got shortages potentially. There's equally from the city has got probably development plans. What are they going to do? What's likely to be kind of up and coming areas? I then I went through, yeah, I did look at employment and who sticks around when I was looking at the professional side. The demographic of the city. If you haven't been there before, the census maps are incredible. They give you these heat maps. I can't believe it's all like free and readily available, but the data. The current census is the 2011 that's on there at the moment, but hopefully the 2021 will come out soon. But it gives you a really good feeling for, you know, actually what's the kind of employment levels in that kind of area, what's the kind of the demographic of full-time students and all that kind of stuff. And it gives you a feel, you start to get to know that kind of that city without having been there. I then also looked at what the competition were doing. So I painstakingly mapped out a good number of existing HMOs onto my map of where they were operating, what size they were, and what areas, what I was going to be competing with, and then the analysis again of Rightmove, who's doing what, what's the general quality of the accommodation, and then I suppose lastly you've got things like the Knight Frank kind of student accommodation survey, which is an unbelievable asset.
It's
If
amazing, isn't it?
you're, it's absolutely unbelievable. If
It's
you're,
like, what do you need to do to provide the best possible service and accommodation for students? And here are all the answers, because we know this is what they, because we asked tens of thousands of students.
yeah, I think it was 70,000 in 2021, and
It's
to
it's,
have access to that at someone that's
it's unbelievable.
operating at a small level is unbelievable. And I think the power of that actually is you can look forward and see trends, because if you speak to estate agents, a lot of their, or sorry, letting agents, a lot of their knowledge is on, what this is what's let in the past, this is what's been going on. But if you see the bigger picture, you can perhaps step ahead of what the competition are doing, take it to the next level, and it's so powerful. I love it.
It was a good friend of mine actually, Howard, that recommended we get you on the show, and I'm so glad they did. And they did say, "Look, Howard's a details guy," and I was really hoping we'd be able to get some of this out of you today. And that was such a great answer. I hope everybody listening today takes so much away from just that answer alone. I think there's this idea that where you pick and choose to invest is just a case of looking on Rightmove and looking at some numbers that kind of look good, but there's so much information and thought that's gone into this decision making process. And I do this the same, and I'm actually quite excited hearing you and somebody else talk about this. And of course, it's no wonder why you're now doing it so well. You're generating momentum and have a clear path to kind of continuing to do this. And another great resource, actually, and this is one I was looking at just last week, is UCAS's report. That they put out a report every year, and it's fantastic because they have data from all of the universities and all of these trends and things like student numbers, and they often project 5 to 10 years ahead because they know what the government's plans are, with regards to things like student caps, maintenance loans, and stuff like that. It makes for exceptional reading. And I mean, if you were starting any business in the world and you could get your hands on that sort of information that basically told you exactly what your customer was going to be doing, where they were going to be doing it, how much they were going to be prepared to pay, business, life and business would be so much easier. And I think people in our industry forget that a huge amount of this stuff is actually available. This is one of my favorite things about the student market, because it is so publicly available, all of this information, yet so many people still don't tap into it, which I find really surprising.
Yeah, no, very powerful. I didn't know about the UCAS one. I'll definitely have to check that out. Yeah.
It's a great resource, and there's some, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information on there as well, but it really is a fantastic resource. So let's fast forward. You've decided where you're going to invest. You've done all of this due diligence and all of this work. How did you actually make it happen? Practically speaking, you're in Amsterdam. You already told us that the first time you saw the first property you bought was when you got the keys, in person, right? How
Yeah.
how did you manage that process? Talk us through what things like conveyancing and getting lending look like, and dealing with agents and even doing viewings looks like if
Yeah, yeah.
you're out of the country.
So viewings is a good one. Yeah. So everything is remote. So I mean, you can do it, but you haven't got the luxury really of, some people say they'll go out and they'll see 50 houses, and they'll land on that one at the best possible price. But I perhaps didn't have that luxury, and I just have to accept that. But I you can use professional services to review um, or look at houses for you. You can then use kind of things like WhatsApp video calls, but and actually see it yourself. But for me, the really it's about the preparation because they're going to turn up. You know, some of them aren't even necessarily that experienced. So if you can max out what the time that they've got seeing it to versus what information you can use. So I would find a house either through speaking to a letting agent or online or whatever. Um, I'll have a pretty good feel about whether that's a good one for what's going to work for me. I'll then prepare key stuff of what I have a preset checklist of what I want them to look at, but I will annotate it specifically to that property. I have the floor plans already kind of prepared, annotated, and it's key stuff like a lot of the stuff, as I said, and want to add value, so they need full refurbs. And not in some ways it makes it easier because you're not too worried about the condition of the carpet or anything like that because it's all coming out. So, but what you don't have and what they're not going to show you on floor plans is little things like the dimensions to the chimney stacks and all that stuff, where you want to put your en suites or off suites. All those kind of dimensions are going to be critical to actually what that refurb is going to cost you. So before I've gone ahead with the viewing, I've got a fair idea of on costs, what I do with the layout. And there's a few other kind of tips and tricks, I suppose, as you can search for obviously the Google Maps, who else has been up into the loft, who else has been out in the extensions. Look for existing sold properties, what's their internal layout, what have they done with the properties, and then things like EPC registers will tell you more information than probably what the letting agent will tell you about existing meter squared. So that will give you a feel for your kind of metrics and your costs. But most of it's all about preparation. Most viewings, I've got a fairly good feel for that. It's probably going to work. And if not, um, I'm just trying to find out, are there any kind of big things missing, like whether it's structural or what's potentially being hidden, what could come as a surprise.
So you're essentially sending somebody to go and do this viewing on your behalf. So you're actually paying someone to go and do the viewing on your behalf, but you've done all of the due diligence before. I guess, are you asking them to do things like measurements when they're on site for you, or you are, yeah.
Yeah, so not everything, but I like the chimney stacks is a big one most of the time. You don't really want to be taking the chimney stack out if you can avoid it. It's a lot of cost of money. And also like making sure maybe on the smaller rooms around amenity standards and making sure that those rooms are appropriate, or do you have to shift the layout slightly? And there's probably minor alignment changes you might need to do, or extensions. There'll be some key stuff that you pick out from the pictures and the floor plans, which are probably going to be needed for the refurb, and it's just directing what those are.
So I guess it's trying to find a way of controlling as best as you can all of these variables. And I guess some of this is actually really important stuff, like bedroom sizes and amenity standards. These are really key elements, and in some cases, could be the difference between it working and it not working. When you think about things like your license. So it's really fascinating to hear about. I suppose you're doing all the same stuff that we would do, but you're just making sure that somebody else fills in the blanks, or just kind of gives everything that kind of double check that you think looks okay. But essentially, you're
Yeah,
still doing and you're still going through the whole process yourself, and making you're essentially not using being out of the country an excuse to miss or potentially slip up on anything, which is again that sort of level of detail I think is critical, imperative, and I'm not convinced that everybody would do that, unfortunately.
no, I think it does get easier though, because especially when you can use professional services, but if you start building relationships with builders and stuff like that, they know kind of what your spec would want to be and all the rest of it. So it does definitely get easier. But it's all about de-risking it really.
What was your experience with in terms of lending from overseas? I know you've been buying single lets, and maybe it was similar to buying the HMOs, but are there any challenges there for somebody like you investing overseas into property on the UK mainland?
So paperwork as any kind of conveyancing thing is. there are a few kind of intricacies, I suppose, of one of, they're naturally more risk averse. You're overseas. It probably
You're overseas.
might help.
Yeah, so you must be money laundering.
Yeah,
It's like-
exactly. Yeah. It probably, maybe it does help that I've got a British passport, perhaps, I'm not sure. But things like proof of address are a big one. So, they're whilst you're going to what is a specialist lender, um, they little things like they want to see their proof of address in English, ideally. Not all your bills are going to be in English, of course. So the kind of, or there's a prime example of this is the Netherlands has a specific document intended for the purposes of proof of address for lending, but they don't accept it because, or they have trouble accepting it because it's in Dutch. So it's just all the little things. It's not, I tend to try and be proactive. I'll put in a translation behind it. I think it's just about trying to give them a level of comfort, I suppose. Um, but it again, that does get a little bit easier because once you've got that first one, if you can line up in advance and you start thinking about it, and you're going for the next one, it's cracking to give a proof of address, send back an existing mortgage statement from
yeah.
another UK lender,
Okay. Yeah.
and no one will tell you this, but I'm pretty sure that they are more relaxed and they're like, oh well, someone's done it before,
Yeah.
he's passed those checks.
Paragon have
Um,
taken a punt on him, so we could probably do the same.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's they'll probably go to their line manager like, oh, this is all right, but
Okay, that sounds
yeah,
like a really useful tip. So, again, it sounds like there are more hoops that you have to jump through. Maybe a bit more friction, and I assume that that might take a little bit longer, cost a little bit more in terms of your solicitors. But ultimately, it can be done, and it's just a case of you just jump through those hoops and you just do what you need to do. Have you come across any real kind of hard no's so far? Has anyone said, how we're not going to lend, we're not interested, we're not comfortable?
no, not really. But saying that, I will always use a mortgage broker
Hmm.
who knows the expat market, because and, they shouldn't be putting me forward to a lender that is potentially got a different criteria, or something like that, or is not familiar or used to working with it. As much as they're specialist lenders, there's definitely some some
That's
fun and games with it, I'm sure, but or experience, but no massive problem so far, to be honest.
that sounds like a really good piece of advice, actually. Make sure your lender has experience working with expats.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
okay.
And prepare stuff in advance. You can speak to your lender before you find a property. What they're going to need. You can start getting your paperwork ready well before, because like I said, it's expensive. It was really busy during conveyancing, obviously around kind of stamp duty holidays and stuff. And if you fall to the back of the queue because of some what's normally a very simple exercise of proof of address, if you're using, investor finance or bridging loans, that could be costing you a lot of money for some admin, essentially, that's just slowing down the process of the refinance or conveyancing.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us then, you've bought the property, you've got your lending, you've picked up the keys. What about the management of builders and tradesmen and planning these sorts of things? Hiring builders at the best of times is a difficult task. Find reliable builders, people you can trust. Did you already have a team in place, or no? So this was new for you. So you were having to find a new team. How did you do that then? Because that is one of the toughest elements of this whole gig, I think, finding the right people. How did you do that, and how did you do it from Europe?
So yeah, no existing team. I had people I've used in the past, but it's slightly out of their radius, and contractors are busy anyway. They're going to take the closest work. So I basically had to start from scratch, and I built up started with recommendations through architects, went to networking events. Most investors keep their builder pretty close to their chest, I find, but the kind of there are builders that will attend network events as well. Had to go through reviews, filter that stuff, but it's probably one of the biggest risks. It was not something I was you know over the moon about having to do, but ultimately I didn't have a choice. And my choice was either I wait or, I do as much as I can to prepare and pick one out. And I think my criteria really was, or two key elements of selecting a builder were, one was around communication. If I'm not there all the time, I want someone that's happily talking to me, picking up the phone, asking questions. No such thing as a stupid question kind of thing. And that's the kind of relationship I wanted to build. And, I wanted to get on with them ultimately as well. Like, this is a long-term thing. I want to build a kind of a relationship of sorts. And then the second is around quality, I suppose, is if you cannot be there constantly, especially whilst they're ripping stuff out, a long-term asset. I don't want them to patch over anything. I've got to get it right, and I wanted their personal pride, that they were going to do a good job, regardless of whether their client was checking in on them all the time. And it's not, it's definitely been challenging, and not without not without its issues every now and then, but nothing that couldn't be overcome. And ultimately, I didn't have a choice. I
Yeah.
had to crack on.
Yeah, I guess there's a point at which you've got to commit, and there's a leap of faith, and you've got to hope that all these conversations and what everyone's saying is actually what they do. But whether you're investing it from overseas or not, that's kind of always the case. I guess it's just again that degree of control and how you keep an eye on it. With your HMOs that you've been refurbishing, do you plan to periodically get back on site, every month or every couple of months just to check on things in person, or have you managed to do all of that from overseas?
No, I have been there. So partly because I actually enjoy that bit. So I wanted to go and have a look. Secondly, it was especially on the first one, I wanted to make sure he was kind of going on the right course. And thirdly, the world had been in lockdown. I had lots of catching up to do of seeing friends and family.
Yeah.
So it was great to kind of combine that. And, I'm not no intentions to be as back um, as frequently kind of moving forward like, well, on a personal perspective, yes, but not on a property perspective. But if you're limited to, you know not very many or visits or none at all, like, then at least if you are going to go, I'd say go probably just after everything's been ripped out. See the bones before it
Yeah.
gets too far. And if you are going to tweak something and you want an hour in, then that's the time to do it. And then
Yeah.
secondly, at the kind of snagging stage, and in between those two, if you can get periodic video calls, photos, build that relationship where they're constantly talking to you, you can kind of get around it. Or you can have someone, you can pay for professionals to go and see it on your behalf, someone completely independent that got no relationship with the builder. They can go in and they can give you a report or commentary on actually what they think and how it's going, and if there's any issues and things.
When it comes to the management, then, yeah, as I always say, when the real work starts, was was it part of your sort of very conscious decision making process? Looking for agents that could do this. Did you have those conversations before you even bought? Were you aware of who could manage it? Because I think again, for a lot of people, particularly when they invest remotely, and I see this more so with professional HMOs, there are less property managers around the country that are equipped to manage professional HMOs. So if you invest somewhere quite far away, it might be a small town with a good opportunity in terms of tenants, but not necessarily the infrastructure to manage. How does one then manage that property is a really important question that need answering. Obviously, when you're buying student property, it tends to be that there's a really high supply of students, a big concentration, and several property managers. Was that a key part of your decision, Howard, having somebody available to manage your property while you are in Amsterdam?
Yeah, so I think the management side was initially is actually one of the primary reasons I actually went for student
Mm,
accommodation. So I kind of felt that you've got term cycles and things like that. You haven't got individual rooms coming in and out, and the likelihood of the people moving in, they're probably a group, they're already friends. Hopefully you're reducing that kind of personal kind of conflict and issues within that stage. Now, if you are managing it and you are an expat that is coming back to the UK every now and then, it's actually quite nice to have that set um, term time. It's changing over. You can align your holidays with it, potentially, if you want to go and have a look at the property, and that's the time you see your family and friends and all that stuff as well. And then the management itself, like there's probably two parts. Like one, yes, I was basically did a bit of research around kind of letting agents that were managing, or is I found it hard to find reviews actually. Although I did speak to some people, but I took maybe a tiny bit of a leap of faith without many reviews of them. But what were they? Were they just managing one or two, or are they actually very active in the market and they were being trusted by a lot of other um, landlords in the same position? And I suppose the flip of the final bit of that is I probably took the spec of the refurb to maybe slightly higher, or not necessarily higher, but I took it to a good spec in the intention that I wanted lower potential maintenance and kind of management issues. I'd rather, maybe take the little bit of the hit of spending a little bit more during the refurb, and that might impact my number slightly, but I'm comfortable. I've got less hassle. I'm not as worried about it from a remote perspective.
It sounds like you've applied that same approach to the due diligence you've done for everything else to your agent as well. And it's really great to hear that, because it is an imperative part of the process. Whether you're managing yourself or you're going to get somebody else to do it, I think maybe even more so if you're going to get somebody else to do it, because there's even less control. So it's great to hear that you applied that same approach. This has been a really fascinating journey through the whole process for you, Howard. And actually, I think the information that you've shared, I think you've actually kind of shared that playbook that you've designed with us and our listeners today. And I think that this has turned into a really unique episode, and I'm so pleased that you've come on and shared this. I suppose one thing, if I step back from all of this, while there have undoubtedly been challenges to doing this, it sounds like you've absolutely bossed it. You've already got a few HMOs under your belt. I know that you're planning many more, and you've done all this in a short space of time. Am I right in thinking that you had, or you sought help from a mentor? And if so, how critical has that part been for you? Was that something that just gave you a bit of confidence, or was that something that actually helped you kind of make some of these key decisions, or even direct you towards looking at these things that became key decisions? For example, thinking about the student market. How, just looking at your overall picture, and I guess I'm interested because you've done this in a short space of time. I think it would be fair to say sort of against the odds. It's definitely going to be much more difficult doing it from overseas. So, how critical has that support that you've had from a mentor been in actually doing this, and what you've been able to achieve?
Yeah, invaluable. Like it really has helped because, one, it's probably in two parts. One at the very beginning, they were you go in there. Most people before they'll speak to a mentor, they already know what they want to do most of the time. They've got a good feel about it, but they haven't necessarily got the experience or the kind of the detail or some of the detail around the execution. And I think at the beginning it was very valuable to make sure that I didn't veer off from a course that was what my long-term vision was as well, because this is a long-term thing. I don't want to end up with something that I then got to try and manage or unpick, and if you get it right now, and there's probably I probably could have picked different locations. I could have maxed out the potential returns around different things, but if you don't get that strategy right, you've got to pay for it for the rest of the time. So, and then once you go into the detail, like someone that's been there before and just asking the right question at the right time, and when mentorship first starts, you're probably being probably presented some things and stuff like that, and it doesn't take long to flip before actually you're then doing probably most of the talking, and you're going with the kind of issues and thinking about this, and it's actually extremely valuable just to bounce ideas off of people, and it's definitely played a big part in certainly the speed and the trajectory that I'm currently on now. I wouldn't be there without it, I don't think.
Oh, that's great to hear, and I think I hope that really encourages a lot of people listening who see a lot of these challenges, maybe even if they're not investing from overseas, but the right people can really help. And like you say, that process of working with a mentor, it should be an evolutionary process as well. It should be very bespoke and tailored to what's happening at that point in time with the long-term goals in mind. But what's happening on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis obviously needs to change and adapt to what's actually happening on the ground in the business, and I suppose in our lives. So I'm so pleased to hear that this is all working so well for you. What can we expect now in the next few years? Is the plan just to keep ramping this up, Howard?
Certainly a few more, yeah. So looking to establish it, I'm probably, might get kicked off the podcast, but maybe not HMOs for indefinitely, but certainly build up that big a cash
We
flow just to give me choice, and then probably diversify in the future. And yeah, looking forward to it really.
Well, it sounds like a fantastic plan. Howard, thank you so much for coming on and sharing this. I think it's been a really, really interesting episode. I'm sure that this will be hugely valuable for anybody investing from overseas, but also anybody investing here in the UK, because I think the plan and the structure and the process that you followed is, and in fact should be, completely transferable. Everybody looking at investing for the first time should, I think, in all honesty, do exactly what you've done. Thank you so much, Howard, for coming on the show.
It's cool. Thanks for having me.